What is freedom and what is liberty? All right, so let's get into it because nowadays I see this term being thrown around willy nilly freedom. But really, if we don't understand the true fundamentals of freedom, how do Republicans view freedom? How do liberals view freedom? How do fascists view freedom? How do socialists view freedom? Then how can we even understand what we're fighting for and what we are fighting against? Because the truth is this: if we do not understand the true philosophy of freedom, then how can we enact the proper policies to either protect our freedoms or get rid of them in certain aspects? And how can we trust our politicians to make the right decisions with our very freedoms that they, in some cases right now, are trying to take away? So let's get into it. So this all starts with philosophy. And I know that philosophy gets hated upon because some people call it a useless source of knowledge. But the truth is this: if you are in politics, you are a philosopher in action. The entire idea of being a politician is being a human theory in action. That is the truth. Politicians are philosophers in action, and we need to understand this. So, to understand freedom, we need to ask the proper questions. Why can freedom not exist as an abstract term? Because actually, it's pretty complex. And secondly, we need to ask the dangerous questions. Is freedom only capable to exist under constraint? If so, what is that constraint? What is the difference between the constraint of the state and the government? And we need to ask an even more dangerous question: who validifies freedom? Is freedom validified by the nation? This is a question which has spurned the radical ideologies of history. So, we need for this video to not think as liberals, but to think as progressives, because liberals, of course, are defined by how they view freedom. And for this video, I want to enact a term which some of you maybe have not heard. It's called civic republicanism. And keep it in the back pocket. And once again, be very careful. Please, please, please do not confuse it with modern republicanism, which is a complete departure and bastardized version of civic republicanism. It is a joke. It is a scam. It has nothing to do with civic republicanism. And if anything, modern republicanism is actually just a more austere, individualized monetary form of liberalism, but it still is liberalism. Both, basically, the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting for different forms of liberalism. So, what is civic republicanism? Civic republicanism was an idea that existed in the antiquity, and it viewed freedom as a non-denomination, meaning freedom did not exist within the state, it did not exist away from the state, it existed within humans themselves. It was the freedom of participation. That's why it's called civic republicanism. And republicanism because it was a departure from monarchy. That is what republicanism is, quite simply. So once again, nothing to do with the modern Republican Party. So to not get confused, let's call this civic republicanism instead progressive humanism. It's a much more comfortable term, perhaps, with our very polarized ideologies. So I want you to keep this idea of freedom as a non-denomination. So let's define and let's go back to the basics of liberalism. So nowadays, this term liberal is kind of thrown around really willy-nilly. Oh, you're a liberal. Oh, you're a conservative. But what really is a liberal? A liberal is a person who views their freedom primarily as a departure from the state. It comes from the word liberty. Liberty is defined as a freedom that is negative from the state. So we need to ask, if a person is fundamentally free, how can freedom come from itself? And I know this may sound like a silly question, but a lot of philosophies is asking silly questions. And next, I want to paint a scenario. A person is trapped on a boat. And don't worry, I'm going somewhere with this. At first, they think that they are free from the land. But very quickly, They, for some reason, forgot their food, forgot their water, and then they realize they are trapped in the boat. What first started as freedom away from the constraint of the land became the constraint of a vast openness. Keep this in the back of your mind, how a negative freedom, liberty, can become a constraint. So, next, I think that we need to begin asking, is freedom actually only able to exist within a constraint? So, many philosophers have tried to ask, what is this constraint? And what a lot of philosophers have boiled this down to is the state. Can freedom only exist within a state? And I think that we need to be very clear and ask another question. What is a state? Because there are three types of states of governance. There is the self state, which is where freedom, I believe, fundamentally derives from. You see, the self state is a way of viewing freedom as a person's own ability to govern themselves. It is a person within their own state. It is the unity of the spirit and the body, which presents as a whole self state, or if you want, the consciousness and the body. A person can always be limited by their own constraints. Like, for example, me, my body is limited to the constraint of itself, to its very own biology, to time. But yet I have the freedom to act and to think within the constraints of myself. This is the self state. Next, we have a second type of state, the tribal state. This is whenever there's more than one person. It is generally expressed in clusters, and it is not truly fully legitimate. So, for example, it's a sports team, a school, an institution, and a corporation, a mafia, or a government. All these represent tribal states. They are all very much the same, but where they differ is where their legitimacy comes from and who the power is being distributed to. Next, and also how they get enacted into power. That's a very important one. Finally, we have the nation state. This is a state defined by the borders or territory. So let's go back to the question. Can freedom only be expressed by a state? Well, for this, firstly, I want to go back to liberty and freedom. There is a fundamental issue in liberty, and it's this. If we define liberty by a departure from the state, it needs a state to begin with. So silently, it expresses that humans are not free simply because they're humans, but they're free in a state of departure from the state, and the state only legitimizes their freedom. Freedom can only exist with the state as a departure from itself. For example, to simplify this, I take two pens. If I define this pen relative to this pen, it needs this pen to be relative to this to exist. So, finally, we have also another issue. There's two types of freedoms, as I said before. So, liberty, the departure from the state, right? The liberty away. Linguistically, it's expressed as freedom from. This is absolute freedom, freedom without borders. Next, we have enforced freedom, the freedom to. And it can start very healthily, the freedom to vote, but then it quickly becomes the freedom to serve in the military regardless you want to serve in the military. You see, it is the very enforcement itself. It is the constraint in itself. Let's take democracy in America, for example. This is a great example for the freedom of constraint or positive freedom. In America, what we do is we give people their ability to vote, but we don't actually truly validify their vote with the Electoral College, who up to recent years, in presidential elections, 80% of all votes do not count or are rendered null because of the Electoral College. What I mean by this is this. If you give someone the ability to have a ballot, but you don't actually recognize their true participation, and you call it a democracy, it's not really democracy. It's just giving someone a piece of paper. You see, in America, we value the freedoms of constraints, so the constraints in and of itself. Simply because I tell you that you can vote does not necessarily mean that I count your vote. That's the truth. So this is the freedom of constraint, where systems and constraints are seen as freedoms in themselves, rather than the ability to participate within the constraints. So now we enter in a very strange paradox. What is Trump? Is Trump a fascist? Well, this is where I say that we need to be very careful because we are defining Trump by his end point. Yes, fascism is a distinctive philosophy that happens with the Italian futuristic movement. And therefore, we need to define Trump not by his end point, but rather by his process. Because how then can we compare a Trump to a Pinochet, or Trump to a despot, or Trump to an authoritarian? You see, if we value Trump by his endpoint, we disregard the very process that is happening right now. And we need to realize that it is the very process that defines something, not its endpoint or not its beginning. So Trump is a tyrant. Now, what is a tyrant? Because the only way, if we define Trump by an endpoint, we cannot understand what gave rise to Trump and how our democracy can be crumbled under its very own fragility. So, what is tyranny? Tyranny, quite simply, is this. It is when liberty goes to such an extent that it becomes a constraint, and that constraint becomes the liberty to enact more constraints as a departure from the state. So, this sounds very complicated, but let me explain it. Liberty is a negative freedom, but a positive constraint. Constraint is a positive freedom, but a negative liberty. See, tyranny is when we have constraint defined by a departure from the state to legitimize it. When Trump is able to disregard the Constitution, which is the state, to break our own liberties and enact constraints, such as ICE. This is tyranny. So, we are in a vicious pendulum of negative and positive freedoms, always swaying back and forth. And I think that we need to redefine freedom as the ability to participate within a state, but we also need to redefine what the state is. What is a state? You see, a state is the citizen experiencing his own politics. Or it is the general will and representation of a people who wants to be governed. Now, this is very interesting because, for my definition, it holds up to truth with the social contract. Now, what is the social contract? It was an idea that said that a state can only exist within the general will of a citizen. And this, if you define the state by humans in their natural state, you say that a state can only exist with humans. So, next we need to ask, what is the citizen compared to the state? Because we live in a system where being a citizen has been compared to just being born on a piece of dirt. No, it's so much more than that. Because by just describing a citizen as birth, we disregard their ability to participate within politics. So what is the citizen? The citizen is the localized version of the state experiencing its own governance. And next we need to go back and talk about the philosophers, who are an interesting breed. Philosophers have a way of defining humans within realms, social realms. You have, for example, Homo politicus, which is humans within the political realm. So you have politicians, you have lawyers, the Supreme Court. There's Homo religiosus, or sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but it is man within the religious realm. Priests, pastors, sisters, but it is the people within these systems being recognized. Finally, we have Homo economicus, which is humans within the economic realm. And I propose to validify the citizen as humans within the realm of the state. You see, this is the way that I view it. You have humans, the state, citizens. Citizens can only exist with a state, but states can only exist with humans as citizens. And silently, what my philosophy is saying is the citizen is the recognized participant within a state. You see, if we define liberalism as a departure from the state, we do not ensure a person's choice of participating. But if we have freedom being the freedom to, as the constraints in and of itself, we put forth the constraints and we believe in the supremacy of putting constraints, so voting, without the ensured participation and ability to vote. And so we need to rethink participation as a whole, because participation, in my view, is its very own type of freedom. And the entire reason why we are here today is because we live in a liberal system, an austere liberal system. And I would go as far as to say that Trump is a liberal fascist. So we really need to ask, what does a good system looks like that allows people to participate? This is called the Commonwealth. What is a Commonwealth? A Commonwealth is where we're able to have small businesses and over the big, over individualized corporations. It is not liberal freedom, the individualized freedom, or the enforcement of freedom, the egalitarian, equally crushing freedom, where we say that a person is enforced to serve in the military regardless of choice, but it is the foundational freedom of the freedom of being able to choose if one wants to participate or not. And that is civicism. Civicism is the ability to choose if you want to participate with your community, but it is not the hollowed out enforced choice or simply a not ability to be able to participate within the frameworks of liberal freedom. So we need to really foundationally rethink freedom and its legitimacy as people being states of themselves who are inherently free. And we need to not have equalizing freedom, because we also need to realize that freedom, sadly, is not fully equal, to the point where, let's take, for example, socialism, where in some tyrannical forms of socialism, what happens is you have the total redistribution of the means of production, but you still have people who manage the producers, and you still have a political elite who manages the managers. There will always be a certain hierarchy to freedom. And by this, we need to realize that a teacher is a certain type of hierarchy. You see, we have hierarchies in their natural forms, such as a parent to a child. But what we need to ensure is therefore the equal opportunity of choice and to be able to choose regardless. This is what we are fighting for, not the flattening equality that enforces freedom, but the foundational ideology that a person is equal to choose and to rise how they see fit. And this can only happen within the freedom ideology of progressive humanism, or freedom of, or common freedom. And we need to unite as united progressives under one common ideology of viewing freedom as common. As I've already done a video on this, what does freedom mean if you fight only for yourself? It means nothing. Freedom is under the constraint of a commonness. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually quite a positive thing, because it ensures the ability to participate with choice. And so we need to unite under a progressive common freedom that values common values. And if this video spoke to you, please like and follow, because In this channel, we're going to go into a whole lot more philosophical overviews that are going to explain how we got into this type of government.